Hello, and welcome to IMA's Inside Talk webinar series. The title of today's presentation is How to Ensure the Finance Team Thrives After an M&A, sponsored by Oracle NetSuite. I'm Margaret Lockery, and I'll be your host for today's Inside Talk webinar. It's a pleasure to have Sue Kawaja as part of our program, and she will be serving as moderator for today's event. Sue has been with IMA for over 5 years as Business Development Manager. In this role, she is responsible for identifying and developing business partnerships with companies whose products and services align with the needs and roles of IMA members. Sue is also the sponsorship manager for IMA's annual conference and Student Leadership Conference, which are the signature educational and networking events for the association. Hi, Sue. Welcome to the program.
Thank you, Margaret. I'm pleased to be part of the Inside Talk webinar series, and on behalf of IMA, I want to welcome everyone to today's session. At this time, I would like to introduce our featured presenter for today's program. With us, we have Stephen Wolff. Stephen is Managing Partner and Director at Myers-Holum, Incorporated, MHI, the award-winning enterprise ERP cloud and data integration consulting firm that just celebrated its 40th anniversary. Stephen helps set strategic and tactical directions at MHI, building solutions for customers that work long-term and prepare them for exceptional growth. Please join me in welcoming Stephen Wolff.
Thanks so much for having me, Sue. I'm really glad to be here. It's exciting to be able to present to you all today.
Thanks, Stephen. Before turning the presentation over to Stephen, I would like to go over learning objectives for today's program. After participating in this webinar, you will be able to identify ways the finance team can provide additional value enterprise-wide and increase business agility. You should be able to apply best practices for helping your team embrace change that is necessary after a merger and acquisition. You'll be able to employ key tips for getting the most from your data to take advantage to the next generation of technology. And finally, you will be able to consider insights and guidance when planning for your next digital transformation project. We're looking forward to an informative presentation. So at this time, I'm going to turn your attention to Stephen to begin.
Thanks again for having me. Really excited to go through our agenda today and the overall presentation. So just to start off, what we're going to be talking about, I'm going to do a quick introduction on Myers-Holum, who we are and what we do. I'll go over why this topic is important in the current environment and ecosystem today. I'll also give a little bit of some insight into our qualification to talk about this topic, and I'll speak a bit about the lens and through which we derived some of our insights. And then we're going to get into what we see as the best roles for CFO and accounting teams in M&A transactions. And I'll take you through some of our experience working around M&A and talk about some of the observed traits that we've seen of successful business integrations. And then we'll also talk about some of the timing and how we can leverage a systems transformation to drive a successful M&A outcome. We'll wrap it up with some key takeaways in conclusion, and then we'll go through a Q&A. So I believe before we kick off into the meat of the agenda today, we have a quick poll. Sue, I think you wanted to read through the poll.
Sure. Attendees should see the first polling question now open on your screen. If you cannot see the poll question, please refresh your browser, which should correct the issue. I would like to remind all participants that you may begin responding to each question as soon as it appears on your screen. Our first poll question is, what is the most important thing for the finance team to get right in a merger and acquisition? Your options are A, assesses the strategic fit for companies before merger and acquisition. B, compare projected performance before and after transition. C, take care of due diligence and demonstrate the value to the shareholders. D, develop a roadmap post-transaction to ensure financial stability and growth. Or E, all of the above. Please note, after selecting an answer, you must select the Submit button, which is located on the right side of your screen, just below the response options, in order for us to successfully record your answers. And now I'm going to turn your attention back to Stephen and to see how you guys responded.
Okay, great. I think pretty predictable results here for our initial poll. Most of you responded all of the above. And I think that's a pretty accurate response in terms of what my expectation was, that all of these aspects are important for finance teams to get right for an M&A. I think it's also very interesting to talk about the second largest response, response A, assess the strategic fit for companies before the merger and acquisition. That's definitely a given. And what we're going to talk about today is not so much the success of an M&A in terms of the initial identification of an M&A opportunity, but really more how to carry through, or how finance and accounting teams can carry through a successful execution of a business integration after an M&A transaction occurs. But I think obviously strategic fit up front as a prerequisite is obviously extremely important. So I appreciate everyone's responses. We're going to move on now into the rest of the presentation. Before we start, I'm going to give a quick overview into Myers-Holum, the firm that I come from, who we are and what we do. So Myers-Holum is a tech services firm. Essentially, we're ERP implementers. We've actually been around now for 40 years, founded in 1981. And in our 40-year history, we have, as you can imagine, been working with a number of different business applications, from computer associates to SAP to Informatica, large-scale data warehousing, as well as ERP. But right now, in 2021, one of our primary focuses is actually on NetSuite ERP. And we've become very active in that middle market ERP implementation. Firms that do between 10 million and 300 million in revenue is really where a lot of our experience lies. And we are what we call a full service firm as well, meaning that not only do we implement ERP, but we also supply the business integration, systems integration, program and project management around sort of a full-scale digital transformation. So while our focus is really on the core ERP, accounting and financial systems, our footprint is generally even a bit larger. We're working with the full IT architecture and financial and accounting systems architecture for the companies that we service. What we do in terms of ERP implementations, just as I've discussed, obviously end-to-end implementation, and also a big part of this is data migration and business intelligence. So bringing over a company's legacy data, merging data together through a master data management system. And we also will support our clients in a managed service for years on after the initial ERP implementation through additional phases and acquisitions, et cetera. So after a quick introduction on what we do, I want to talk about why successful M&A is important, what's going on in the ecosystem right now. So first of all, M&A, especially in today's environment, are becoming pretty commonplace. There's a lot of activity between acquisitions, divestments, consolidations, and there's an immense amount of expectation on the value that needs to be derived out of an M&A transaction. At the same time, businesses that are conducting M&A activity are presented a host of different challenges. They have different financial systems. They have potentially a lack of integration between the two companies or multiple entities that they're merging together. And there are also potentially a lot of compliance and security issues that we see our customers facing when they want to acquire a new entity or merge two together, or maybe even divest a department to another buyer. And as well, taking specific actions to ensure that M&A goes smoothly and that we're realizing the value that we expect really means addressing the challenges up front and having a strong amount of experience in what it takes to make an M&A scenario successful. So as an ERP implementer, I wanted to talk about, why I would be qualified to talk about this, what type of insight I can provide to you all. I don't identify myself as an M&A professional. I'm not in, the financial services sector, but over hundreds of ERP implementations that I've been a part of over the last 10 years, probably a third of those have been timed or centered around some sort of M&A activity. So again, whether it's a roll-up of a lot of small entities together into one larger organization, if we're working with a large enterprise customer that's divesting or carving out one department and selling it to, let's say, a private equity firm or a smaller business, if it's one middle market company acquiring one or more other middle market companies, or simply even just an ownership transfer of a business, there's often an ERP project or a financial systems overhaul that is associated with a lot of these scenarios. And given that it's now about a third of our business centered around these activities, Myers-Holum, my firm, has maintained relationships with a lot of private equity companies, their in-house consulting groups, as well as interim CFOs that have made a career out of supporting organizations through M&A activity. So it's very common for us that on the timeline of our ERP project, we are operating under what's called a transition services agreement, which is basically the contract of sale and the details of how the business will transition from one owner to another. Additionally, why is this important right now? Well, as you might have seen or experienced, 2021 is shaping up to be incredibly busy with M&A activity, especially in the middle market. We're seeing in some reports an increase of 45% same month last year in M&A activity just across the globe. So regardless of COVID, there continues to be a really large increase in activity of M&A. And in the middle market especially, I think that's at an all-time high. After most entities realized that there was a light at the end of the tunnel with COVID, there was all that pent-up demand, or those acquisition deals that were on pause restarted, those timelines accelerated, and in a survey with KeyBank, apparently more than half of the businesses that they talked to responded and said that they were very likely or extremely likely to complete some sort of acquisition transaction within the next 6 months. So there's a lot of this activity going on, and that's been great for our business as well, again, because there's so often a need for systems implementation or some ERP work to be done around these transactions. And so while we have a huge increase in the volume of M&A activity, successful outcomes are not as commonplace. So if we look at deals between 2012 and 2015, given 3 to 5 years for those outcomes to materialize, a survey by Ernst & Young replied that 70 to 90% of M&A deals are considered failures, or they didn't meet the intended targets from when the deal was made. So we know that it's a risky business. We know that there's a lot of work. It can be very complex and difficult to complete a successful M&A outcome. And so from our lens, why do some fail while others succeed? And what we've seen from our boots on the ground consultants being around these scenarios so often is that there are a few challenges in terms of culture, business process, and technology. But where we see success is where there's a clearly defined process for the SOPs of the new business, that there are folks that are working in these new entities that are assigned to be the integration manager, that have it be their kind of core duty to take ownership over not only the deal itself, but the success of the outcome of merging and integrating two businesses together. That clear metrics are defined for measuring the success of an acquisition or a merger. That we monitor those metrics in a very frequent way. And that as well, I think most importantly, that business processes are standardized, the technology stacks are unified, so that we can actually facilitate all of the measuring of KPIs, and we can maintain a whole lot of business continuity that we need in those first 100 days at the outset of a merger, and that will set the stage for successful outcomes down the road. So this will bring us to our first poll question. Have you been part, just want to talk to the group here, have you been part of a post-M&A integration so far in your career? Have you been tasked with facilitating and working around the integration of an acquisition, whether at a new company or your entity at some point so far in your career? And we'll give just a few seconds for everyone to respond here.
Thanks, Stephen. Attendees, if you cannot see the poll question, please refresh the browser, which should correct this issue. And as Stephen said, our second poll question is, have you been part of a post-merger and acquisition integration in your career? Your options are A, yes, or no, or B, no. Please be sure to click the submit button located on the right side of your screen, just below the response option, so we can correctly record your answers. That being said, I believe we are ready to move forward, Stephen, to see how attendees responded.
Okay, great. Well, it looks like over half of you that have responded so far have been part of some integration activities around a merger acquisition. So that's great to hear. And hopefully for those of you that responded no, this could be valuable information or just insight that you can take with you if you ever do come across that scenario in the future. So the good news, I think, for everyone on the call today is that we believe, and the data shows, that highly involved finance and accounting teams are critical to the success of M&A. So I believe this came from a McKinsey study, but it was highlighted in CFO magazine. They talked to 200 global CFOs and found that cost and revenue synergies were a lot more likely to meet targets when the CFO was closely involved in the process of the transaction. So for the 76% of companies that said that the CFO was highly involved, the difference from revenue synergies was 67% over 32%. And we strongly identify with this as well, in the sense that the boots on the ground finance and accounting folks are extremely critical to this success, and they have a lot of power over the success of a post M&A integration. And so that's what we're going to talk about next. So what have we seen? What are the roles that accounting and finance teams can play in these post M&A merger and integration activities? So the three kind of key roles that we see that CFOs and finance teams can make, first of all, I think in any case where we see these M&A transactions to be successful is when we have someone from finance or accounting actually acting as the transformation sponsor. As well, the key pieces of information that can be communicated to the rest of the organization, all of the stakeholders in the acquiring company and the newco, that key communication, I believe, is very important to come from finance and accounting teams. Over more, let's say, a COO or a CEO even, there's a specific insight and a specific reason, we'll talk about this later, why we believe that finance and accounting teams should be that communication leader. And as well, especially when we're talking about merging teams together, CFOs, finance and accounting teams have the opportunity to be a cultural role model to all of the new stakeholders, all of the new employees that will now be working together in this post-M&A environment. And in our experience, we've seen that there are really two types of CFOs that we get to work with when we're implementing new systems post M&A. And we've kind of bucketed those very simply into deal makers and operators. So, and I'll talk a little bit about what these are next. But first off, deal makers are folks that are brought in and oriented as CFOs or let's say SVP of finance in organizations that are very focused on identifying and making that deal happen. Everything that kind of happens before that transaction closes. So they generally are offering pretty limited value after the deal closes. CFOs that are deal makers generally don't have a lot of experience working in boots on the ground. They're a lot more finance focused than they are accounting and controlling focused. So they tend not to focus on the actual integrations and operations of the new entity. They're not so much on focused on the goals and synergies that are promised to investors. They tend to believe that if the business that they're acquiring is the right strategic fit, that those synergies should naturally occur. They're not necessarily management oriented, and that's because they're generally coming from a financial services or banking or investment background, and they might not have a lot of experience actually working as a boots on the ground, let's say accounting or controlling process oriented CFO that is going to be kind of rolling their sleeves up and integrating the two businesses together. So again, they lack that boots on the ground experience. And for this reason also, especially in the middle market, we see that a lot of this deal making is often outsourced. We don't have someone that's working full time in the organization that's going to be driving that deal or that transaction. We do see that, in most cases, the aspects of that M&A are generally outsourced to third parties. So we have another poll question coming up here, just to get a pulse check before we talk into kind of the other bucket of CFOs that we've categorized. So Sue, I'm not sure if you wanted to read this off to the team.
Sure, absolutely. Attendees, you may respond to this question as I read through it. Our third poll question is, what is the most challenging aspect of the post-M&A integration that you expect a company to experience? Your options are A, integrating legacy IT systems, B, cybersecurity and data protection, C, supply chain management and integration, or D, team culture across companies. Please be sure to click the submit button again on the right side of your screens. And while we're waiting, Steven, how about you give us an example of, in your experience, what is the most challenging aspect?
So for us, I believe the one of the most challenging aspects that we've witnessed, and this might be biased because we integrate IT, we work in cybersecurity, we work in supply chain management and integration, but what might be the most intangible and thus the hardest to realize is merging team culture across companies, is keeping stakeholders in the new business engaged, bought in, motivated to make it happen. So from our perspective, that's something that's very hard to measure. Kind of team culture can be kind of subjective. Not to say that any one of these responses are correct over the other. And we've got 95% submitted here. So Sue, let me know when you want to move on, but I'm interested to see what everyone else has to say as well.
Perfect, and we're ready to move forward. Okay.
So interestingly, everyone else also, I think the winner here at 40% was team culture. I guess as well, folks on the call today have kind of a similar experience as me. This is something that is hard to measure. We're not going to talk so much about that today. We're going to talk about a little bit more of the hands-on aspects of an integration, but this is definitely a challenge, I know, for a lot of organizations. So before the poll here, we talked about there are two types of CFOs. We've got deal makers and operators, and this is kind of how we've bucketed it out in our experience. This is kind of how we refer to the finance and accounting teams that are our clients as well internally. I'll talk about operators now, CFOs or finance teams that are operators. What are the characteristics of what we call an operator? So operators are boots on the ground finance or accounting professionals that are very in tune with the mechanics and the SOPs and the operations of both the legacy entity as well as the new entity. So they're focused on key drivers for the business. They're focused on the day-to-day operations. They've got a knowledge of both very well insight into their current team as well as the new team, and they're merging those teams together in an efficient way, especially in the first 100 days after integrating businesses together, after that transaction closes. They are dead focused on business continuity, making sure that both businesses don't have any downturn in sales or increases in cost or a lack of synergy. And they're also very used to leveraging systems, processes, standard operating procedures to identify areas of the business that they can integrate and then scale from that foundation. And really they're intent on realizing the vision of the deal maker, hitting those profitability targets, realizing the efficiencies that M&A can bring, and working towards those KPIs that might even be involved in a predefined exit strategy. So next, we're going to talk about observations that we have from successful M&A scenarios. And again, these are scenarios where post-integration, we have in our finance and accounting team operators that are driving the business integration. So first, in a successful M&A scenario, we'll generally have these questions answered. Before the transaction occurs, we have our future state finance and controlling processes well defined. So when we're working with clients and we're implementing new ERP, or we're merging one company onto an existing ERP, when we go in and ask questions such as, how will the new chart of accounts be structured? What will be the new finance and accounting headcount? Are there opportunities that you've already identified to merge existing processes? How will key reporting be produced on day one, 100 days after the transaction? Generally, we are asking clients these questions, and when we see successful M&A outcomes, it's when these questions can already be answered immediately after the transaction occurs or even before it occurs. So that type of due diligence and planning we see is very important, and this is kind of a litmus test as well into when we believe that an M&A transaction is going to be successful. Similarly to the answers around how we're structuring our chart of accounts and finance and accounting processes, IT and systems road mapping should also be executed before the transaction occurs. So the clients that we work with generally already have some understanding of which systems are going to be retained in the new entity, which systems might be expanded, which systems we're going to deprecate, we're no longer going to use. And they also tactically have all of the related vendors engaged on the right timeline. So we're not rushing or jumping in, scrambling to find a vendor that's going to help with data migration or systems integration or the like. That's already been planned out before the transaction occurs. As well, is the new entity right-sized for the planned system landscape? If we're carving out a department from a large enterprise that's running SAP, we're not going to try to retain SAP or make a $50 million company run a large-scale ERP that's oriented for a global enterprise. Similarly, if we're going from being a $50 million company now to a $500 million annual revenue company, is the legacy ERP that we have a right fit for this new organization, or is it going to kind of crumble under the weight of our new process and procedure? So a lot of these questions also should already be answered before the transaction occurs. Business integration activities as well, I think this is really important, are executed in tandem with system integration activities. So what we're saying here is that as we're going through the process of implementing new ERP, new technology for the business, we're using that as an opportunity. We see business using that as an opportunity to merge the businesses together from a business process standpoint. So we know exactly somewhat of the fit of our new technology systems because we've already done the work of planning ahead and thinking about the business integration aspect. So can we implement new software as a way of merging team workflows together? When we're going through those requirements gathering sessions for ERP, is that an opportunity for us to pull the new entities into the same room and have them speak through and enumerate their processes from a business standpoint as well? And finally here, another kind of litmus test for a successful M&A scenario is that data retention and data access is made available easy to all future stakeholders. So this is actually really commonly overlooked, especially in scenarios where we're carving out one department from a larger entity. How are we going to merge together the historicals? So we know what our future state chart of accounts is going to look like. We know that we're going to merge our invoicing and AR processes together. but how are we going to run comparatives from year over year? Or how can we look at consolidated financial reporting going back 5 years if we're only going to be merging these two businesses together from now going forward? So there needs to be a lot of thought and planning into how we're going to retain a lot of that historical data, because that historical information and data is also going to be very important for us to measure our success and our performance going forward. And it's also very likely going to be requested in management and executive reporting. So what do we see what do we experience as an implementer working with companies when we see that M&A is going well? Well, we're seeing excited, enabled staff with low attrition. And that, I think, means that everyone is very aware of the scenario. Everyone is understanding of a very detailed plan of action for those first 100 days. And people know what to expect. Our employees, our stakeholders, they tend to need to know what to expect in order to be enabled and feel like they're taking part in this activity. So, that means we need to prioritize employees. We need to align them to our business objectives. And in order for them to know what to expect and to feel bought in, these integration plans need to be predefined. We can't be, jerking teams around. And the easiest way to do that is to predefine a lot of these business integration plans that I've just discussed. And also, I think clearly the objectives of an M&A transaction, they are often aspirational, and they need to be aspirational, but also they need to be attainable. So in a lot of cases, what we see is that, especially in finance and accounting teams, there are a lot of folks that feel like after this acquisition takes place, they're doing double duty. They're doing the accounting job now for two entities. And planning ahead and being attainable and being realistic about what our new combined teams have the capacity to execute, I think, is also really important. So moving on, because we are ERP implementers and we're so often working around these M&A scenarios, I want to talk a little bit about, I've got a few slides on how an ERP implementation can satisfy a lot of the scenarios that we just discussed. How can we sort of lean on an ERP project to facilitate a lot of these successful business integration and M&A outcomes? Well, the first is that in every ERP project that we do, we're going into a great length of defining future state processes. We write what's called a business requirements document, a BRD. We're very often also writing what's called SOPs, or standard operating procedures, for the new system. And a lot of companies will find it very efficient to tack on their business integration activities and tack on their planning to our future state design process for ERP. Because ERP is so widely encompassing of business process and operations, a lot of answers in terms of business integration are provided with the system definition and the system architecture. And in the same vein, when we are defining IT systems road mapping, we're also aligning that IT system roadmap to the end stakeholders' roles and responsibilities in the ERP. So as we're planning out how we're going to integrate two businesses together, there's a lot of information that we can learn from consolidating the business technology, the business systems, that helps us derive what our efficiencies will be from a business integration standpoint, from a people and process standpoint. And finally, again, what we see a lot of companies finding very efficient to do is executing their business integration discussions, workshops, and activities with our systems integration. So all of these bullets below are business requirements workshops, our system unit testing, our user acceptance testing, our end user training. These are all great workshops and activities where we're merging employees together from the combined entities. They're sitting in the same room and they're going through now a consolidated process, a merged business process together for what will be represented as the new entity. So these are kind of three ways that I've just gone over where an ERP implementation can actually help facilitate a lot of the business integration planning, execution, and discussions and design that would naturally occur around an M&A transaction. And we've got one more poll here for the team. So Sue, if you wanted to like to read off that poll.
Sure. Thank you, Stephen. Attendees, if you cannot see the poll question, please refresh your browser, which should correct this issue. This is our last and fourth poll question. When would be, the question is, when would be most advantageous, to leverage an ERP implementation in relation to a post-M&A integration? Your options are A, implement SOPs with future state ERP before potential transactions. B, determine future state and ERP roadmap immediately after a transaction. Or C, determine future state and ERP roadmap 1 year after the transaction. After selecting your answer, please make sure that you click the submit button so we can record your answer correctly. And just wanted to remind everybody that we are getting some amazing questions here, which we surely be getting back to you guys. But if you have any questions, please make sure to send us a question by using the Q&A panel on the right side of your screen. And with that, I'm going to say we can go ahead and move forward.
All right. So pretty equally distributed answers here for when would be the most advantageous to leverage an ERP. I'm pleased to see that most respondents answered response A, implement SOPs with future state ERP before a potential transaction. And this is the response that I feel is most effective. For B and C, determine future state and ERP roadmap immediately after a transaction. In our experience, when a transaction occurs, when a company concludes the transaction to acquire another or to merge two entities together, there's often a limited timeline of transition that the selling entity is willing to take to continue to retain ownership and operational responsibility for the business. And during that limited timeline, which could be 6 months or a year, maybe even longer, but during that transitionary phase, there's a lot of stress on the business knowing that they are going to very shortly transition to new ownership, and that new ownership is going to be basically responsible for their business continuity. So determining the kind of the future state of ERP roadmap immediately after the transaction is generally necessitates that we've got a very short runway to work with. And that's why we prefer that when we go in for an ERP implementation, that our clients are already at least completed with a high-level sort of planning or analysis, and they've already gone through some of those due diligence activities, understanding both what their SOPs are and need to be, what the new SOPs are and need to be of the newly combined business, and also at least have a high-level technology roadmap of what that combined ERP is going to look like. And again, I think a key takeaway from the presentation today, the ERP project itself, provides a lot of venue for us to merge businesses together, not only from a systems process, but from a people and business process as well. So as we're going through and implementing ERP, we're designing and defining the future state. This is both for the systems, the technology, but as well, a lot of ERP implementations are going to outline what the future state of the business process will look like. How are we going to provide that future state of business continuity and operational efficiency? When we go through the process of IT systems road mapping, we're also defining headcount, departmental ownership and responsibilities, stakeholder role and responsibilities. And we're also, looking at both of the entities and determining what the best process is. Are we going to retain manual processes, or are there opportunities for automation? And so the kind of the key takeaway here, I think, for the presentation today is that ERP implementations are a great way not only to implement new systems, but to execute business integration. And I had one other slide that just got nested right after the poll, but I think the final and really important aspect of how an ERP project can facilitate a business integration is that an ERP project is also going to encompass our planning around the retention and consolidation of all of the historical data that existed before the businesses merged together. So there's a lot of consolidation that we do of master data across customers and vendors, as well as our historical financials, so we can very immediately report on our KPIs and our business drivers. So just for the last few minutes here before we get into the Q&A and our evaluation survey, what I hope that you all take away from the presentation so far and for today. I think first off that finance teams are uniquely positioned to drive the success of business integrations. We look at the data, we look at a lot of reporting from banks and management consulting firms, and a lot of that data indicates that when finance and accounting teams are involved in those post-M&A integrations and activities, those integrations tend to become more successful. Finance and accounting teams should drive the key operational decision-making and execution on integration activities. So it's really not enough to be a great deal maker. You can be a CFO that identifies a very well-fitting acquisition target. There's a lot of strategic synergy from a macro and economic and strategic perspective. It could make all of the sense in the world. But if we don't focus on the key boots on the ground operational processes and efficiencies, there's a larger risk of that integration, even for a perfect fit acquisition, not panning out. And how can we create a framework around business integration while also remaining efficient? Well, we believe that an ERP implementation project provides a lot of the venue and opportunity for us to have the conversations, to have the design workshops, and provide the opportunities for employees at the newly formed business to work together and align on a single set of processes, procedures, SOPs. And that ERP planning should incorporate and emphasize all of your possible future state M&A scenarios as well. So because the ERP for a lot of companies is really the backbone of the business, how are we setting that up to account for future potential M&A transactions? So let's not only think about just the next opportunity or the next deal, but are we aligned in how we build that ERP, how we write our SOPs, how we define our processes? Are we aligned with what potentially could come in the future? And I think that's a very important key takeaway as well. If you believe that an ERP project can help you be successful in merging businesses together, then you should also plan on that ERP being able to handle potential future transactions that may not be identified or have materialized yet. But now, with about the last 15 minutes, we'd like to jump into some Q&A.
Perfect. Thank you, Stephen. Attendees should see the evaluation survey now open on your screen. If it did not open, please click the evaluation survey icon at the bottom of your screen for access. We appreciate your feedback, so please complete the survey while we address some of the audience questions. So the first question here is, you touched on the logistics of bringing two businesses together. What is the best way to drive a successful integration?
Well, so there are a lot of activities that go into driving a successful integration. But I think to answer that in a concise way, and it really aligns with the key takeaway of our presentation today. If there is a need for new technology in the new entity, we believe that a well-timed and well-planned ERP implementation has immense benefits in driving the business integration activities between two entities. It provides a backbone and framework for a lot of the workshops and conversations and design sessions that these two entities would already be having. We're essentially writing a list of consolidated standard operating procedures, and we're also really focused on business continuity between the two entities. So in the event where ERP is going to be implemented on a short time frame, we believe that planning that ERP implementation around the business integration has a lot of positive effect and outcome on the two entities. But if that's not the case, if there's not a need for merging systems together or implementing new ERP, how we're successful in driving outcomes of business integration really comes down to proper due diligence and planning, and I think the right amount of focus on the business integration activities. So again, it's being that operator, not being that deal maker. You can be both. Generally, it's pretty rare to find folks that can operate on both sides of the ball, but being operationally focused and not relying on the predefined synergies or strategic fit of an acquisition target is what we've observed drives successful outcomes in the hundreds of ERP projects around M&A that we've participated in.
Thank you, Stephen. So we actually got quite a few questions about culture clash. So I'm gonna go ahead and take one of those here. So the question is, what are some of the measures taken to mitigate cultural clash issues during M&A?
That's a great question. The cultural aspects of M&A, we are less focused on delivering solutions for. But I can definitely speak, having been involved, in around so many of these, I can speak from some of my experience. I think a lot of the stress on your stakeholders from both teams comes out of lack of information. If the stakeholders are ill-informed onto what their future role is going to be, what the future outcome is going to be of the transaction, that's generally what starts to cause a lot of stress and potentially even turmoil between these two teams that now need to be working together. So it really needs to be very clearly communicated what the plans for the business are, how the new teams will form and work together. And I think over-communication is a characteristic of business leaders that we've worked with that drives a lot of motivation and enables stakeholders to really participate in a successful outcome. So I'd say, from a cultural standpoint, that's going to be very different from a lot of different organizations. The one overarching answer that I can give is that over-communication is key. Don't leave your stakeholders feeling like they're in the dark, and try to be as upfront as possible. And as well, I think sticking to that plan that's been communicated is very important.
All right. We heard it. Over-communication is the key. All right. So the next question is, how do you deal with an acquisition where acquired systems are on premises while the acquiree has systems in the cloud?
That's a great question. So that is that's a lot of scenarios that we actually participate in, is going from on-prem to the cloud. Generally, we're moving in that direction. So in pretty much all of my experience, we're not going from cloud back to on-prem. So the entity that possesses the cloud infrastructure or cloud ERP will be containing the new process and procedure from the on-prem system. And it would be similar processes merging any two ERPs together. We tend not to try to build interim integrations or throwaway integrations of technology. So we don't tend to see implementations where we're building a new financial system that is only going to exist for 6 months or a year. Rather, we kind of see a lot of companies wanting to tear that Band-Aid off and jump right into what the new future state technology architecture will be, hopefully for the next 10 years or 20 years. So I'd say that if anything, we're moving from on-prem to the cloud, and a lot of that historical data, if we are losing access to that on-prem system for whatever reason, there's also a very large onus for us to store and archive that data in a cloud environment as well, even if it's not structured, but just so we have it for the future.
Great, thank you, Stephen. And there's a question about integration. So, and I know the short answer is it varies, but we wanted to know, audience would like to know, how long should it take to integrate an acquisition? So if you can give us like an average of, from your experience, how long does it really take to fully integrate?
Yeah, that's a great question. In the middle market, companies between, let's say, 10 on the very low end to 300 or 400 million in revenue, maybe up to $1 billion in revenue even. We see, I'm constantly seeing 6 months as a time frame that's provided, generally negotiated between the buyer and the seller, to get everything off their current state architecture, their current ERP, and to start using the new systems. So for a lot of companies, that's actually a pretty aggressive timeline to implement a new ERP. But that's just the reality of a lot of the scenarios that we work in. I see generally just commonly between 6 months and a year as a predefined transition timeframe.
Great. And another question on, again, integration. For a larger company with over 2,000 employees, the payroll integration process should be part of financial system integration, or it should be separate payroll integration process?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Sure. For a company with over 2,000 employees, the payroll integration process should be part of financial system integration or a separate payroll integration process?
Did you say payroll integration?
Yeah.
Okay, so for, payroll specifically, I think getting into that level of specifics, I think is really situationally dependent. But in that case, I would still stick to our, the opinion that we've developed after seeing so many of these integrations, that it should be sponsored by the finance and accounting teams. That's where we see the most success and successful outcomes. I think especially for something like a payroll system, and this is largely dependent on the type of payroll, the type of company. Is this a professional services organization? Is it a manufacturer, right? Is this 2,000 person company buying a 100 person company, or is it 1,000 and 1,000 that are merging together? So there's a lot of information that I think would go into that answer. But from an overarching perspective, we believe that the finance and accounting team should be really in the driver's seat of a lot of the business integration activities. Not, again, the operators should be responsible, not so much the deal makers, right? Or the folks with maybe the strategic vision aren't always the best to actually merge those entities together. We're really looking at the folks that have a deep insight into the day-to-day operations of the business to affect that outcome.
Great, thanks, Stephen. So our next question is, are there any legal issues to start discussing features before implementing a new ERP?
I'm gonna defer that question. I'm not an M&A professional. I'm not an attorney, so I can only talk about my experience here. But I will say that companies have a widely varying amount of due diligence that we see them perform, and when we get brought in to effectively roll out a business integration or roll out a systems integration as part of a transaction, there's a huge amount of variance in the amount of planning that went into that transaction that affects, our level, that was part of the due diligence phase. These due diligence phases are generally highly confidential. Only certain folks from the business are involved. And for folks that are senior enough to be involved in these pre-transaction activities, earlier in the presentation, I went through some of the questions that should already be answered. And so I would say, I'm not sure, from a legal perspective, what is okay to discuss and what isn't. I think that's probably not for me to respond. But what I can say is that there is a pretty huge variance that we've seen in how prepared companies are, and how aware they are of the challenges that they might face in integrating businesses together for those really hands-on, boots-on-the-ground processes.
Thank you so much, Stephen. With that, I'm just going to have one more question. So question is, how do you avoid the most common pitfalls of moving to a modern ERP solution from an antiquated legacy system?
So the most common pitfalls, I'd say, for moving between systems, I think for the accountants and finance folks on the phone here today is the concept that most modern ERPs are what we call continuous accounting, whereas legacy ERP systems are posting back to the general ledger in batch. And moving from, let's say, a batch processing system to a real-time processing system is a pretty big change in mindset for a lot of finance and accounting folks. So proper training and education is what we focus on. We want our stakeholders and end users not only to be aware or informed of what the new system does, but by the time we go live, they should be very comfortable and confident and feel familiar with the new set of processes and procedures in the new system that they're using. Ample training, ample preparation is probably the biggest way that we mitigate common pitfalls. And the biggest pitfall that we have is really lack of end user adoption, confusion around the time of go live. And just hands-on time in the system and training is how we mitigate that.
Great. Thank you so much, Stephen. And with that, I'm going to turn your attention back to our host, Margaret.
Thank you, Sue. At this time, I'd like to thank our presenter, Stephen Wolff, for sharing his knowledge and expertise with us. We're very appreciative that he's made time for IMA and for our audience today. And also, thank you, Sue Kawaja, for moderating today's event. I want to again thank Oracle NetSuite for sponsoring today's webinar, and thank all of you for your participation in today's event, your commitment to IMA, and your professional development through IMA's Insight Talk webinar series. I look forward to spending time with you again soon when we'll enjoy some more Insight Talk.